thank you all for coming. I'm Christianisation of Europe, Vice Principal of Research. If, particularly those, there are a few spaces still in the middle, if you could squeeze in even further where possible. I know that most rows are, but where possible, if you see that there are gaps in the middle, if you start just shuffling along, because I'm sure further people will want to join us as we start. So thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Heather, who's going to talk on the conversion of Constantine and the Christianisation of Europe. Before we start, I was just going to read through his biography. I always get stalled at this point because often, or too often, in the college, the first sort of date that you get to was the date of their appointment. And Peter was appointed in January 2008, so it's terrific that we've actually got round to the lecture. So I apologise for that. He started his undergraduate and postgraduate studies at New College in Oxford, and did his PhD on the Goths and the Balkans from 350 to 500. And then briefly went off to be a mandarin in the Treasury, before deciding to return to academia, this time to Worcester College, and got the Murray Research Fellow, which at that time, I believe, circulates, but at that time was at Worcester. He then went and spent a decade at UCL before returning to Worcester again for 5 years, and then was appointed to King's in 2008. We come to it that then sort of I don't green with jealousy about. He has had various sabbaticals, including 3 times at Dumbarton Oaks in DC, which I must say must be a very delightful place to spend some time. He's published 5 books in various combinations of 9 languages, including the forthcoming book on barbarian popes and the restoration of Rome. Which my spell checker corrected to barbarian posers. I'm not quite sure how it did that, but anyway, thank you, Peter.
And thank you very much, Chris. My spell checker once turned Burgundians into Burundians all the way through on Burgundian law, which caused a certain amount of confusion in early medieval circles. I did think it was probably time that I did an inaugural lecture before I retired. It would be a shame. I suppose one could combine kind of starting it and leaving it there. The more serious, slight apology, of course, I'm only pretending, is for the title, which is a very hackneyed title, of course. Everyone's heard of Constantine's conversion, vision of the cross, winning victory at the Milvian Bridge, and on it goes. And it's a topic that has been kicked around the block so many times that it looks like Muhammad Ali towards the tail end of his career. Or if one's using a more erudite kind of metaphor, you can tell when you're in the company of a topic that's seen too many people working with not enough evidence, because it becomes like a chess match. At every move on every piece of evidence, there's a counter move. So you have the opening gambits and the replies, and on it goes. And I can't offer you any new evidence on Constantine's conversion. Those of you who know any late Roman history won't be remotely surprised by that. The reason that I'm nonetheless going to make you listen on this topic for the next 50 minutes, so I have got a clock, sorry, is because I think there's one dimension of the topic that hasn't been explored as much as it might be. And the central proposition of what I'm going to offer you is that the evidence that we have for Constantine's conversion needs to be thought about in the context of the public operation of the political culture of the central Roman state. And when you do that, or the late Roman imperial state, and when you do that, an alternative range of possibilities open up. That, as it were, is the first line of argument, and that will take a bit over half the paper. But beyond that, whether you accept what I'm going to suggest might be the conclusion, the logical conclusion that follows from that observation, whether you accept that or not, then I do think that the operations of the Roman state in its central ideologies and public political culture do explain, whether you accept what I will say about Constantine or not, something very important about the way that Christianity develops, both in the context of the later Roman Empire and then subsequently across its spread across Europe. So that's my justification for the very grandiose title that is added on the back of Constantine's conversion. So let's start with Constantine's conversion. What do we know about it? Well, the evidence for his religious persuasion falls into 5 very straightforward chronological phases. First of all, he becomes emperor in 306, and in the immediate aftermath of 306, the religious stance of his regime is in line with the religious stance being put forward in the rest of the Roman Empire. At that point, we have at least 5 and sometimes 6 emperors floating about. I'll come back to them in a minute. But it's the official religious ideology of Diocletian's tetrarchy, great deal of emphasis on the cults of Jove and the identifications of senior emperors, Jovi with Jove, and junior emperors, Herculii with Hercules. Then 310, we get the first change. This change comes, Constantine has a vision of Apollo, somewhere in southern France. There's a flash of light in the sky. And from that point, his coinage and the public stance of his regime, we have a spokesman with his regime who comments shortly after this event. It switches from that official tetrarchic line to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, which is a reversion to mid-3rd century religious ideologies surrounding the imperial office. So Constantine gets on happily with Sol Invictus for 2 years until 312. He does change a lot. Between 312 and 324, it all becomes rather more ambiguous. We get quite a lot of Sol Invictus still on his coinage, but he also passes an edict of toleration towards Christians. Lactantius, writing in this 12-year window, tells us that he has a dream, that a dream of the Christian God, telling him that this is the divine power who is making him victorious. We also see Constantine engaging positively with problems in the African church in a way that suggests he's rather more than just tolerant of Christianity, but actually positively inclined towards it. Yet at the same time, the ambiguity comes in because the Sol Invictus, unconquered sun coinage carries on, and a monumental arch that he puts up in Rome is studiously ambiguous. It refers to a single, most powerful divinity, but avoids saying who this most powerful divinity might be. There are 3 examples of a very rare medallion, a very large silver coin on which the Cairo Christian symbol appears on Constantine's helmet, but only 3, and most of his coins are Sol Invictus. So there's evidence that he's already inclining towards Christianity, but his official stance, the public stance of his regime, is much more ambiguous. Then the final phase, I've got a horrible feeling now I said 5 phases, but that's only 4. I can't remember. Hey, I'm a historian, not a mathematician. I can't add up, I can't add up. From 324 onwards, both on his coinage and in official letters, he becomes explicitly and straightforwardly Christian. The cross starts to appear on his coinage. Sol Invictus hangs around for a little bit, but then disappears very quickly. And genuine letters of Constantine preserved in various writings of the church historian Eusebius. It used to be disputed whether these were genuine, but no one disputes that anymore. Everyone's very happy that they're genuine. Explicitly declare a preference for Christianity. Christianity is Constantine's preferred religion because it's the best religion. It's the right religion. He is moderately tolerant, still more than moderately. The only anti-pagan measure that we have evidence for is a ban on blood sacrifice. You can toss olive oil around, you can light candles, you can do wine libations, that's fine, but no killing things. This is disputed, but I think the evidence actually is indisputable. The point is, of course, that there's no enforcement mechanism. So no one's going around checking what's actually happening. So there are some cases where people are carrying on killing animals and looking at entrails, all the other good stuff that they did in the ancient world. But that doesn't actually contradict the evidence for the ban, which is, I think, completely convincing. It's just that no one's enforcing it. There then follows deathbed baptism, more or less, and he's buried surrounded by altars of the 12 apostles in the Church of Holy Apostles in Constantinople. So our evidence for the public declarations of Constantine with regards to religion fall into these very clear phases. And you'll see immediately from what I've been mentioning that the evidence is a kind of mixture of the extremely public, so declarations on major ceremonial occasions by imperial spokesmen, what's stamped on coinage, and things that look a little bit more private, like Lactantius's reference to Constantine already having had a dream of the Christian God. That dates somewhere in the first half of the 310s, and so on. So all of this stuff is very well known, and the set of questions that it throws up, given the chronological phases, are equally straightforward. Exactly what date did Constantine become Christian? Related to it, what kind of understanding did he have of his Christianity? It's been argued extensively, particularly by Hal Drake, but also by others, that in this era, unless you were a really hard-end bishop, there was a lot of monotheistic overlap between some of the more developed forms of non-Christian philosophical belief in particularly the Greek half of the Roman Empire and Christianity. And a lot of people who clearly didn't think that you had to choose between one and the other. So it's entirely plausible and possible to think that there's a phase in which Constantine, if you asked him, would say he was Christian, but didn't see any problem with carrying on with Sol Invictus while doing so. And then the sort of third question, alongside date of conversion and what he thought he was converting to, one that was asked particularly by Burckhardt years ago, is the genuineness of it. Did Constantine convert to Christianity? He clearly did, from 324 onwards, where the evidence is totally unambiguous, because he thought it would serve some imperial purpose, or is it a question of genuine belief? Most people now don't worry about the genuineness of belief. I think that's a kind of rationalist 19th, early 20th century sort of question. People don't really concern themselves with that. And I won't at this point, although I will offer a comment on it a little bit later. it seems to me when you read the sort of recent accounts of Constantine, then most people are happy enough to follow the kind of chronological outline of the phases, suggest some kind of progressive conversion on Constantine's part, as that evidence would, at face value, and most naturally suggest. In other words, he is some kind of dodgy solo monotheist, comes out a bit more of a Christian at some point, and by the time that he dies in 337, is fully and fairly unambiguously committed to a more fully developed and more rigorous form of Christianity. That, of course, is putting the issue in, of what he understood and what he didn't understand about his new religion. Actually, the best bit of evidence that he didn't quite get his new religion are his burial arrangements. Cyril Mango has talked about this, and I take the point from him. I don't think he's ever put it down in print. It's typical of Cyril's sense of humour that he wouldn't write out the jokes. But Constantine is buried surrounded by altars to the 12 apostles, and you'll find it usually said that he thought of himself as the 13th apostle. But actually, the 13th person surrounded by the 12 apostles in all Christian theory is actually Christ. And it is noticeable that Constantine's son, Constantius II, very quietly rearranged Constantine's burial arrangements. So it may well be that Constantine had a slightly grandiose vision of what position he was actually to occupy in the new religion. That aside, I want to try and subvert the gradualist view a little bit more profoundly than that. And it starts from an initial observation. These phases, the new phases that you see, 310, 312, 324, are always marked by a major victory. 310, he defeats the Emperor Maximian. Maximian is like Frank Sinatra. He keeps having comebacks. He keeps retiring and then coming out of retirement. At one point, Constantine is very firmly in alliance with Maximian against Maximian's own son, and then not. They have a falling out in the summer of 410. But Constantine's first change of regime stance on religious matters comes after he successfully got rid of Maximian in the summer of 310. The second one, in 312, comes when he's just got rid of Maximian's son, Maxentius, after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Not before. Really important. The final change of regime comes when Constantine has defeated his rival in the east, the Emperor Licinius, to take over the entirety of the empire. There's a very simple point that needs to be made about this, and that is within the operations of Roman state ideology, victory isn't really a significant thing. Victory is the prime imperial virtue, and it's the prime imperial virtue for one simple reason, namely that emperors claim to be appointed by the divinity to run a state that the divinity takes a unique and peculiar interest in. And if divine support means anything, it must mean victory on the battlefield. So when an emperor comes out after victory and tells you, oh, I used to talk about Jove, but actually it's Sol Invictus. Or the next one says, well, I used to talk about Sol Invictus. Actually, it's sort of the Christian god, but maybe a bit of Sol Invictus. And then after the third victory, tells you that no, it's the Christian god. Then you need to be more than a little bit suspicious. Because victory is, of course, the ultimate justification and legitimization. And once you've won your victory, you're in a position to claim divine approval in a way that your opponents are not. It is the way to make yourself untouchable. That's winning 170-seat majority, not a 30-seat majority. Victory is the big and powerful facilitator makes a regime secure and untouchable. And of course, what it's implying is that we're not dealing with a kind of distant watchmaker kind of God who sets the cosmos running and then sits back. You're actually dealing with a directly interventionist divinity who makes things happen in the here and now, and you can see in the course of political events within this God-guided empire in particular, the divine hand at work right now. That's the vision. And it's important then to sort of take that point, that vision of the divinity, and realize how profoundly structured in to the official, ceremonial, and public political life of the empire it is. It's very easy, of course, not to take it seriously. We know that the western half of the Roman Empire is going to disappear within 170 years of Constantine's conversion, and that most of the Eastern Empire is going to be swallowed up by Islam. And in those kind of contexts, claims to be divinely inspired, divinely supported in a unique kind of way look like the bullshit they are. But of course, no one knows that in the 310s. No one knows that in the 310s. In the 310s, the Roman Empire is over 1,000 years old. The Roman Republic is over 1,000 years old. The actual empire, at its fullest extent, more or less, apart from Britain, which no one cares about much anyway, sorry, is about 450 years old. It's been around forever. It's still enormous. And although it had gone through a rocky patch in the 3rd century, it had been put back together extremely effectively. The Persians had just been defeated. Things were looking good. And when you start looking for the evidence for what public life was like in the Roman Empire, you see that this idea is everywhere. One of the most extraordinary sources to survive from the later Roman Empire are the minutes of the Senate meeting which greeted the arrival of the Theodosian Code in 438 on Christmas Day. Nice present. What's very odd about the minutes of the Senate is the ceremonial form that the greeting took. It took the form of, to start with, of repeated shoutings of acclamations. So they started off with some very general ones. I've got one example for you. May it please our Augustuses to live forever. You know, politically, that's not very dangerous thing to say, obviously, even if it's somewhat hopeful. This they repeated 22 times. So they shouted that ritually 22 times. And the way the minutes are set up, you get this sequence of general acclamations, and then they get turned around. This is where it gets really bizarre. If you think that's bizarre, it gets more bizarre. And they start chanting specific things to do with the Theodosian Code and its operation. So we get, in order that the established laws may not be falsified, let many copies be made. Okay, perfectly reasonable. But do you really need to shout that 25 times? Or, getting on a bit further, to the copy that will be held by the constitutionaries, let no annotations on the law be allowed. They were running out of enthusiasm by then, they only shouted that 12 times. I did a little test on this with my son, who was then about 13, he's now about 20 and just gone to university. Without really, we were doing it in English, not in Latin, I think, it would be longer, and we didn't take it terribly seriously, we rattled through it. It still took 45 minutes to get through these acclamations. And that's got to be a minimum estimate. So you have an assembly of the greatest and the good of the Roman Empire on Christmas Day in Rome, rattling off this set of acclamations. I'm always a great believer in what looks oddest is actually the best clue to what's specific about the thing that you're looking at. It's the best clue to get inside their head. And the ritual shouting is actually about expressing consensus. Not kind of cozy, gentle consensus, but total consensus. There is not the slightest doubt that this blasted new law code is the best thing there has ever been, and we're all extremely thrilled that it's here. That, if you like, is the bottom line of getting everyone who's famous, important, and rich on site shouting these blasted acclamations out, repeating. Must have been pretty much ad nauseam, I suppose, if you were sitting there listening to it. But this is not an isolated piece of insanity from the local world. Some of the survivals chime in very well with it are equally public. The minutes of an Egyptian town council meeting survive on some scrappy bits of papyrus. They open with the same kind of acclamations, repeated acclamations. They're just shouting in general about long life to emperors and this kind of thing. They don't do anything interesting like make sure that none of the laws are written out in shorthand, which is what the senators got up to. Imperial ceremonials, the great imperial ceremonials, when an emperor arrived at a major town, the ceremony of Adventus, similarly had these kind of repeated acclamations. And the message throughout the public life of the empire is that we're all totally on board with this, the best of all possible societies, God-guided, God-protected, and God-sustained. On a more private kind of note, it made political opposition, as you can imagine, really difficult. My old supervisor, John Matthews, in a brilliant study of the letters of the Roman senator Symmachus, brought out exactly how difficult it is to say anything negative, even about someone you detest, as you can show Symmachus did. But the most he could manage, after someone he particularly disliked died, was, shame he's dead, in a kind of ironic way. What he meant was, of course, he was glad the bastard had died, but he couldn't say that. That was not allowed. You could not come out in public and express that kind of degree of dislike about someone in the normal course of events, because you're all part of this structure, which is the best possible structure that there could possibly be. You're probably all way ahead of me, but it seems to me that the closest kind of analogy that we have to this kind of thing would be the old congresses of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It's that kind of public political life. I always loved it. You used to get a minute's clip on the 9 o'clock news, and the last speaker would be applauded uproariously by the entire crowd, and then the speaker would applaud the crowd for applauding him, and everyone was united in the joy of the truth and brilliance and beauty that had been displayed by everyone right now. So, in its culture and its mode of operation, I would suggest, the late Roman Empire has to be thought of a type of one-party state. Certainly an arthritic one, and it's not one that's without its internal rivalries and killings and whatever, but show me a one-party state that doesn't have plenty of those. And from that observation follows the central point that I want to make about all potential Constantinian conversion narratives that you might construct on the basis of those chronological phases. You have to put the public life of the later empire and its essential one-party state nature into the foreground. Unless you've done it, then you're going to miss potential dimensions, or possible dimensions of the story. Again, I suspect you've probably all done the working out for yourselves, but let me just spell it out. Each stage of the Constantinian journey towards death and baptism follows a major victory. Victory is the ultimate legitimation in this God-guided political culture. It is, I think, therefore, pretty hopelessly naive to think that statements made after victory about how we've suddenly changed our mind reflect necessarily the internal processes of whatever it was that Constantine believed at any given point. It's too loaded. So, you know, Constantine can't talk about Solem Victus in 310 until he's won a victory. He may suddenly have seen that vision of the sun and converted, just happenstance at that moment, but it is the victory that allows him to talk about it. And if that victory hadn't happened, I doubt that he would have changed the stance of his regime away from the official religious ideology of the old Tetrarch, and so on and so forth. What, of course, this makes possible is that the well, actually, no, wait, let me do something else first. Sorry, I'm slightly changing my mind. In other words, public stance on religion, where religion is part of this one-party state ideology, you can't simply believe what someone says in public. And there's an extremely good parallel for what I'm suggesting about Constantine, and one that, on reflection, I'm slightly surprised does not get discussed alongside the Constantinian story, not only more often, but in fact every time that it's discussed. What I'm talking about here is the case of Constantine's nephew, the son of his half-brother, Julian the Apostate, the guy who will become the Emperor Julian. Famously, Julian is the last direct male member of Constantine's dynasty to rule, and he's the one who goes native and institutes worship of the what he thought were the ancestral cults, although there's an awful lot of innovation was part of that story. He was also a great and, I would say, almost staggeringly tedious writer about himself and his beliefs, so we're very well informed of the progress of what he thought. Once he was safely in power, once he'd safely become emperor, sole emperor, and was running the entire empire, Julian dated his conversion away from Christianity to the traditional cults to the very early 350s. It's a period when he was hanging out in Asia Minor with various philosophers. I use the word philosopher very loosely here. Julian liked people who could make statues smile and torches burst into flames. We're really talking Darren Brown, not Nietzsche. But the official stance of the ruling imperial regime of his cousin, the Emperor Constantine II, was Christian, strongly Christian, a bit more Christian than the Emperor Constantine. To have come out as pagan, or non-Christian, better to use non-Christian, at that point would have been a straightforward death sentence. Constantius liked killing his relatives anyway, a bit like Clovis, that would have been fine. Another excuse for a happy day at the office. So he couldn't. And he hides his non-Christian allegiance through the early 350s, when he's still studying, the early years of when he's made Caesar in Gaul by the Emperor Constantius, and then even during the early phases of his revolt against Constantius, the revolt that would lead into the path of being sole Emperor Augustus' turn. Epiphany 360, Julian is still going to church because he's engaged in negotiations with Constantius, still hoping to do a deal. And he knows that if he comes out as pagan at that point, then Constantius will take any deal off the table, it will be outright civil war, and Constantius runs more of the empire than Julian does, so there's only one likely winner if he does that. Julian's hoping that he'll be too much of a pain in the neck, and therefore Constantius will do a deal with him instead, but he can't come out as pagan. He doesn't come out as pagan until the usurpation is firmly underway, and Constantius providentially dies while declaring Julian his legitimate heir, all without knowing that Julian had given up on Christianity. And of course, the providential death of Constantius, Julian's seeming victory in the civil war that nearly happened with Constantius, that's a legitimizing victory for him, then to bounce out of the closet and declare his allegiance to non-Christian cult. It's also often wondered, what on earth was Julian thinking of when he subsequently invaded Persia? My own hunch, because you can't come up with a rational explanation for this, is that Julian wanted the big attention-gathering victory that the Persians would provide. Persians are the enemy of choice for the Romans, much better to win a victory over them than, as Constantius put it, half-clad Germanic savages in the West. In order then, because if he had come back with victory over Persia, then he would have been in perfect ideological position to ram home his reversion of the Roman state to non-Christian cultic practice. And if you think about it, it's all too easy to line up Constantine's public utterances about his slow march towards Christianity against a similar background. In other words, in the first stage, there are 5 or 6 emperors. If Constantine comes out as Christian then, 4 emperors are tolerable, more than 4 is not. He will be the one that the other 4 turn on. So, can't come out of the closet then, and so on through the other stages. What I'm suggesting, of course, is that if you put the one-party state ideological character of the later Roman Empire back into the Constantine story, it opens up the distinct possibility that the story of Constantine is not so much, or not totally, one of conversion, but at least partly one of coming out, like the story of Julian. And in fact, there are lots of little indications that there's Christianity lurking in, particularly the family of his mother. And indeed that his father may have been occupying this kind of ambiguous ground between, sort of solo monotheistic ground between Christianity and paganism. But his mother is Helena, who, of course, will find the cross, true cross, eventually, long after her death, in fact. It was very clever of her. His sister is called Anastasia, resurrection, looking a bit Christian, and so on it goes. I can't prove to you that he was a Christian or it's a coming out story, but when you think about the way the late Roman state works, it's at least as possible. And what I am quite sure about is that when an emperor tells you from the bottom of his heart what he really feels in the aftermath of victory, don't believe a bloody word of it. It would be wrong to do so. Unlike Julian, just as a final thought on that line, you never get Constantine turning around and saying, oh, actually I was a Christian from 298, 303, whenever it was. You never get that kind of story. And you might argue that that perhaps gives the light of what I'm suggesting. But actually, I don't think it does, because Constantine could not say something like that. The reason he could not say something like that is straightforward. When he comes to power in 306, the official line of this one-party Roman state towards Christianity was one of overt persecution. Now, his father went a bit light on it. He only kind of pulled down a few churches. We don't know that his father ever killed anyone, no martyr, or no convincing martyr narratives from Constantius' area of control. But Constantine did not break from the public line of persecution. He didn't declare his hostility towards it until he's won 2 victories, in fact, after 312. It's only after the Milvian Bridge that he starts, that he puts in the declaration of toleration. Now, the reason why he couldn't possibly say he'd been a Christian earlier than that follows straightforwardly from that, because early 4th century Christianity is riven with disputes between people who gave in to the persecutors and people who fought them tooth and nail and were willing to die for their new religion. I'm afraid my rather infantile mind conjures up a poster arrived. Emperor Constantine, pipe and slippers, sitting in the armchair, his young Caesar sons at his feet. The caption underneath, "What did you do in the Great Persecution, Daddy?" Couldn't be there. Couldn't possibly be there. That admission is not possible. So, my first conclusion is in a sense a negative one, because I can't prove that Constantine was a closet Christian, and that the story is really one of coming out when it's safe, rather than the sort of intense conversion story we'd like people to believe. But I hope I've done enough, actually, to shed some doubt in your minds about it. And I want you to take the vision of, not Constantine, the vision of one-party state, rather arthritic one, admittedly. There's plenty of room in the corners for doing your own thing as long as you don't advertise it. But arthritic, if not, but still one-party state with us as we move on. Because I'll now try and justify the sort of grander element of the title I offered you, the Christianization of Europe aspect of the title in about 16 minutes. So it'll be reasonably fast, you might say. But I wanted to take that point about the late Roman state and the way it operates and develop two further propositions which follow from it about how conversion to Christianity proceeded in the Roman Empire and beyond into the early and central Middle Ages. And these two propositions both stem from thinking about the way that public life operated in the late Roman state, then in the context of when the empire becomes Christian. The first proposition concerns emperor power within the new Christian world. And it's this. Given the long established, indeed entrenched ideologies of the Roman state, that it was uniquely brought into being by the divinity to serve God's purposes, it was only natural for the Roman emperor, a Christian Roman emperor as such, to assert a position of great authority within the developing church. And it was equally natural for most people to accept that. What that overall ideology implies, of course, is that an emperor is far more than a secular ruler. I always think secular is a concept that's invented by some really clever people in the Vatican one Sunday afternoon after a couple of good grappers. Because it's a way of emasculating rulers of their religious authority. That's the point of the concept, secular. Well, no one's invented it yet, by the time that we're talking about, in the 4th century. Constantine is a ruler, his successors are rulers, they're appointed directly by God. And by God that brought responsibilities, but also power in its way. It's famously picked up by Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine's biographer, amongst other things, who points out that it's no accident that Christ should have been born in the reign of the Emperor Augustus, who founds the Roman Empire. That shows you that Christ and the Roman Empire are meant to go together and that they have a beautiful future ahead of them. We all know, of course, that eventually emperor power will be sidelined, at least in the Western Church, by the Vatican. And this makes it quite difficult to write the history, because in a sense, when you know that something is going to end up somewhere else, you always write the story of how it ended up in that somewhere else. So you find the points that lead to the other destination, and you join them up, and you get that story. And that story is very well told. But if you step back from that kind of intellectual project, explaining the rise of papal power, as it were, and start again at first principles, and look at all the evidence that you have for the various chronological phases of the church starting from Constantine's conversion, then you get a different picture. Well, you're trying to describe a different object in a sense, so of course you get a different picture. If you think about it, the powers that popes enjoy, which allow them to act essentially as Latin Christendom's CEO, where Christendom is a multinational corporation, are quite straightforward to describe. You decide what correct doctrine is. You don't have to make it yourself, but you have to take lots of learned advice from philosophers, but bishops particularly. But you make the decision in the end as to what's right or wrong. The buck stops here, as you're the CEO. You make and enforce rules of Christian piety, for laymen and for clergy. That's part of the job description. Equally part of the job description is making top ecclesiastical appointments. You don't care who's Bishop of Lesser Bothwell underlined, that's not interesting, but you do care who are the bishops and archbishops of major cities. So if we take that kind of job description, that list of powers, and look for who's exercising it in late antiquity, they're all in the hands of emperors. Quite straightforwardly, quite unambiguously. The 4th and 5th centuries, because emperors make it possible, is a period of great continuous church councils and meetings whereby most of Christian doctrine is hammered out in its final details. The emperor funds this. It always strikes me, it's a bit like getting a huge grant from the European Science Foundation to run a series of workshops and then the occasional plenary session, all with the object of sorting out what Christianity should believe. And that's broadly what you see happening between the 4th and the 6th century. Well, not only do emperors pay for it all, they also call the councils, they usually fix the agendas, and they're responsible for enforcement. They're the police force. Equally important, when you look at the pattern of when disputes come to an end, they usually come to an end when it ceases to be possible for one of the parties to persuade an emperor, a new emperor, whomever, to back them. It's the pattern with the Donatus dispute in North Africa. It's the pattern with the Arian dispute across the border church. Dispute is only possible when imperial regimes are persuadable of the opposite point of view. Once you get unanimity at court, that's it. End of story. It's even been recently argued in a new thesis that the long-standing monophysite dispute at the tail end of the 6th century was coming to its conclusion at the time of the Great War between Heraclius and the Persians, and that the imperial court had finally irrevocably made up its mind as to which way it was going to go in that, and that you could see the start of the enforcement mechanisms and their effects at unraveling large-scale support for the losing side in that context. So emperors don't, as it were, make up doctrine, but they're massively implicated in the process. It wouldn't happen without them, and they are doing a lot of the deciding. Emperors make a lot of top church appointments. Also, imperial law has a lot to say about discipline within the clergy and true piety for laity. There's quite a lot in church councils, of course, about that too, but then again, the emperor called those and paid for them, so that comes back to his job extension. Equally important, by extension, you find in Western Europe that the kings of the successor states to the Roman Empire, even the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, when they get around to being Christian again, inherit the same body of powers that Roman emperors had possessed in relation to the church. So, from Gregory of Tours in 6th century Francia, what jumps out at you is that Frankish kings choose bishops. If you want to be a bishop, go talk to the king. They also call and enforce the councils that deal with discipline. There's not a lot of doctrine going on in the post-Roman West. That was a bit advanced, really, but there's plenty of stuff about discipline, piety. And actually, I'm being unfair, there's a bit of doctrine going on. And that again turns on the will of kings to call the councils and enforce their decisions. Or even if you look at our homespun Synod of Whitby, there famously, that can be made part of a narrative of increasing papal power in the sense that the Oswy, king of the Northumbrians, says, well, which side St. Peter on? Right, I'm voting with him. But if you look at the story fully, what you see is two sides presenting alternative views on how to date Easter, and the king decides after listening. There's a perfectly good late Roman image of royal responsibility for correct doctrine and correct practice carried on. And if, I'm begging pardon, many people who know far more about this than me, but if you take it forward to Charlemagne, then Charlemagne's attitude and actions towards the church fall entirely into this pattern, that it is an emperor's job, a king and an emperor's job, actually to ensure correct Christian practice within the realm that he controls. You see it in the kind of bullshit statements, the admonitio generalis, the programmatic victory, the large-scale statements come out of Charlemagne's court, but then also the real oomph, because Charlemagne is not just bullshit, Charlemagne is really trying to do things. So he's twisting the arms of archbishops, making sure the right men are in power, and they in turn are working on the bishops and all the way down, and that energy is coming out of Charlemagne's court. The Pope was there, much respected, and Charlemagne enriches him like there's no tomorrow, but I think probably my single favourite piece of early medieval source material is Charlemagne's opening letter to Leo III. I'll read you a little bit. This is Charlemagne. It is our function, to the extent that divine goodness aids us, externally to defend Christ's holy church on every side by force of arms, against the incursions of pagans and the devastations of infidels, and internally to strengthen it in knowledge of the Catholic faith. It is yours, speaking to Leo now, Most Holy Father, to aid our struggle with hands raised to God, like Moses, to the end with you interceding and God guiding and granting, the Christian people should at all times and in all places enjoy victory over the enemies of its holy name, and the name of our Lord Jesus Christ be glorified throughout the world. So, in other words, Charlemagne is responsible not only for kicking the pagans, but also for the running of the church internally, and the Pope is his senior vice president with responsibility for prayer. End of story. And that is the reality that emerges from the Carolingian sources. All the oomph for Christian reform is coming out of Charlemagne's court. It's not coming out of Rome. There are, as a consequence of Charlemagne's actions, a few popes who show considerable ambition in the later 9th century. But the point to make about that, although this is obviously a significant development, and I think it is, I wouldn't want to say it's not, it is a significant development, but the point I would make about that is that these uppity popes are able to be uppity within the developing context of the Carolingian Empire. Without the empire being there, they would not be able to exercise the kind of influence they did, both over divorce and in rather grander statements. In particular, the development that's really fascinating is that a concept of papal authority is invented by Carolingian bishops, who are now extremely well educated and capable of doing some really good forgeries. They invented a series of legal forgeries called pseudo-Isidore. And the reason that they invent a late antique church which never existed, where popes were powerful. The reason they do it is not to make popes powerful, but because Rome is bloody miles from Frankfurt, as far as I can see. The point is not to make the pope powerful, but if you can say that popes are more powerful than your wretched archbishops who, revved up by Charlemagne, are bearing down on you, this is a way of restoring episcopal independence. It's not really about Rome, it's about getting the archbishops off your back, and that's what happens. And what really confirms that it's the degree of papal assertion that we see in the late late 9th century, is absolutely dependent on the Carolingian Empire, is that it disappears in the 10th century along with the Carolingian Empire. You do not see same capacity or even the same ambition amongst 10th century popes as you do among the late 9th century ones. And there's a kind of symbiotic relationship there between the greater papal ambition of the late 9th century and the Carolingian Empire. When the Carolingian Empire goes, so does that greater ambition. I don't propose to pursue that story any later, but it's only in the 11th and, in my view, through the 12th and into the early 13th century that you finally see, for very particular reasons, the eventual transfer of CEO authority from kings, and particularly emperors, to popes. I think broadly because there are too many kings. So it doesn't look, where Charlemagne runs virtually the whole of Latin Christendom, none of his successors do the same. So they can't provide the same kind of overarching structure of control and guidance for the entirety of the Latin Church that Charlemagne can. And I think you actually see kind of consumer demand from the type of churchman that Charlemagne is creating for a single, I think as it were, Charlemagne creates the concept of Western Christendom, then the Carolingian monarchy can't provide the single unitary leadership that they're looking for in that. And then the transfer slowly and rather messily occurs. So the first point that follows from thinking about the political culture of the late Roman state and the role of the emperor within it is that it inserts imperial authority into the church, and this will have a 700-year future at least, maybe a bit longer. And 700 years is a very long time. In other words, Constantine's conversion profoundly shapes subsequent development of authority structures within the Western Church. Then finally, one last point, because I see I've been going on for about 55 minutes, and it's time to bring it a little bit towards a close. But I don't want to leave without developing the second point that I think follows naturally from this one-party state political culture of the later Roman Empire. And that is namely this: once Roman emperors convert to Christianity, once it's safe to come out, if you believe my story, or Constantine's eventually conveniently seeing the light after seeing off all the cults and declares Christianity, they don't immediately start persecuting pagans. As I said, Constantine institutes a ban on blood sacrifice, but that's it. But although they're not persecuting, they are very explicitly making their preference for Christianity as the better form of religious cult clear in the subsequent generations. There's a huge fight about how many Christians there were at the time that Constantine converts. That obviously relates to whether Constantine might have had some nefarious plans, cunning plan in converting to Christianity. And some people have come up with as many as 10%. Given that 90% of everybody in the empire is a peasant, and aside from certain bits of Egypt and North Africa, Christianity hasn't even begun to penetrate the countryside in the early 4th century, and given that we know Christianity is not even predominant in the towns, I find the 10% figure completely unbelievable. I think it's considerably less than that. No one thinks anymore in the early 4th century that Christians kill babies at midnight and drink their blood. You know, Christians are an accepted part of the world for most people, and the Great Persecution is distinguished from earlier ones by the lack of any kind of popular enthusiasm for it, a willingness to pretend that when Christian churches hand over their shopping lists that that's the sacred scrolls, things like that. There's all kinds of stuff like that goes on. But I can't see that Christians are anywhere near 10%. Insofar as that relates to genuineness, of course, it does suggest that Constantine is very Christian, in my view, because I can't see any particular reason why he would have wanted to move to this religion otherwise. And certainly, the old ideologies of the Roman state provided just an effective arthritic one-party ideology, or series of potential ideologies, as the new religion does. So I don't quite see the force of that argument. But anyway, total numbers aside, the thing that everyone does agree on is that there's not much sign of adherence to Christianity in the Roman political classes, the gentry and aristocratic landowners that fill up most of the senior positions within the Roman state. There's a kind of vague reference to one anonymous Christian senator in the 310s, but that's about it that anyone's ever been able to come up with. It's a bit of an offhand reference. What changes between the 320s and the 390s is that we see a sea change in the religious adherence of this class. To such an extent that by the late 380s, and particularly in the 390s, you actually can start active persecution of non-Christian members of the upper class, denying them the chance to serve in the imperial civil service or whatever. And I think, like most people, I take it that that very aggressive legislation of the 390s is a sign that the game's already up. In other words, that most of the political classes are already Christian. Because there's not much sign of massive response to that. If this was a divisive measure where there was still a lot of non-Christians in the old ruling elites that make up the political class of the empire, you would expect quite a lot of vituperative response, and you don't see it. So between the 320s and the late 380s, then I think you see the conversion of the critical mass of the Roman classes. What I'd argue, I won't develop the argument fully or too much like to this time stuff, is that the coercive, initially informally coercive power of imperial preference plays a very considerable role in that conversion narrative. You still get non-Christians being employed by Christian emperors in between the 320s and the 380s. But they have to cut their cloth according to the prevailing ideological stance. The most successful pagan of all in that period is a pagan philosopher called Themistius. And Themistius has to come up with an emasculated form of traditional religion which stresses the degree to which it's compatible with Christian morals and philosophy, and which doesn't mention anything embarrassing like sacrifice. It's an extremely clever act on Themistius' part, and in fact Themistius is explicitly critical of alternative pagan figures who do act in a way that is hostile to the imperial preference for Christianity. So Themistius, what I think Julian regarded as kind of quisling, essentially. But you know, it's still possible to be a pagan and serve these emperors, but only of a very particular kind. And Themistius has to stand up and say that not all paths to the divinity are equal. There's more than one path, but they're not all equal. And when you're saying that in front of a Christian emperor, you're obviously implicitly allowing people to draw the conclusion that you're comfortable with the idea that the better one is in fact Christianity. And the point that follows on from this, of course, is that once the informal coercive power of imperial preference has helped switch allegiance within the Roman elite, I mean, I think this story is a bit like Henry VIII and the spread of his semi-Catholic, semi-Protestant Reformation ideas through the English gentry and aristocracy, though I'm treading far outside my expertise. It's that kind of a process. Once that's happened, then you also see from 400s onwards that the social coercive power of the Roman ruling elite is then unloaded, starts to be unloaded on the peasantry finally. It's only after 400 that you start to get the peasantry being intruded upon. So in other words, the second proposition that I'm offering you is that the conversion of Constantine introduces a second type of conversion process into the story of the Christianization of Europe. Christianity originally spread through peer contact, not quite bottom up, but sideways, if you like, that kind of process. And it achieved a fair degree of success through those kind of mechanisms by the year 300. The conversion of Constantine adds a second type of mechanism to that, namely top-down intrusiveness, top-down coercion, first in the upper class and then more broadly. And that too, I think, when allied to the religious authority that attaches to the emperor, shapes Christianity very profoundly. And this is nearly namely that before the Roman state intrudes itself, Christianity didn't have a central authority structure. It consisted of a series of largely self-governing communities dotted around the Mediterranean that were in occasional contact with one another. Rome had more prestige, but that wasn't an authority structure. People didn't go asking the Bishop of Rome for his opinion on lots and lots of things on a regular basis. It happened very occasionally, and that was it. And indeed, in other more modern forms of Christianity, where that top-down state, intrusive, coercive type of element has been withdrawn, particularly if you look at religious patterns, say, in modern Britain, you're going back to much more that kind of pattern, with various types of Christian community running themselves similar, but not exactly the same as one another, loose, varying, different types of relationships between people. The very broadest conclusion, and I realise I'm sticking my head up in saying this, that I would suggest from looking at the Constantine story, imperial power and upwards, is not, as it were, that Europe might not have become Christian without it, but certainly that the type of Christianity that we see predominant within the European landscape, with first imperial authority and then the transfer of the whole idea of a Christian CEO to the papacy, that does in fact go back to Constantine's conversion. So in that sense, I think Constantine's conversion has some of the most profound implications for the subsequent shape of Christianity and the conversion of Europe. Thank you very much.
Very much. I found that as entertaining and informative as your book, so that was terrific. I just want to go back to the start where you said you got a bit confused about whether you made 4 or 5 points.
Yes.
I used to work for somebody who would, with great authority, say, I have 4 points, and then talk a bit endlessly about how many he had. The important thing here is that somebody prepared earlier, just to make you feel better, a little piece of academic rigour. There are 4 possible worlds, and then there's state. So, between 4 or 5 is perfectly acceptable. Good. There are drinks downstairs in chapters, which is 3 floors below here, 4 floors. For those who can, if you use the stairs, then everybody might get their bite before breakfast. If you use the lifts, we'll be here for a very long time. Thank you again.